I'm Caspar Gray. I work as an independent agent, business manager type role in the game industry. Before that, I worked at both Eidos, SCI, and Square Enix as acquisitions manager, which means I was the person choosing which games for the publisher to sign. I was involved with signing up games such as Battle Station Specific, Urban Chaos Riot Response, which was Rocksteady's first game before Batman, as well as a number of games on DS and 3DS.
Thanks for joining us, Caspar. So a lot of the people I talk to on this podcast come from programming backgrounds, sound backgrounds, those sort of things. What was your way into finding your way to becoming an agent or in acquisitions?
My route into the game industry is a strange one. What I studied at college was inorganic chemistry. And by the time I left university, I knew I didn't want to become a lab chemist as I originally had planned. I was looking into things like jobs in marketing, in consumer goods, working for a big company like Procter & Gamble or Pepsi or something like that. But none of that kind of really panned out for me. And I ended up applying to a job advert for a internet startup company. So this was 1999. It was kind of the height of the internet boom. And there was a company that was an online games retailer. It's just selling games online in the way that companies like Amazon do today. And at the time, there were probably like 5 or 6 of these startups in England, all trying to vie to be the leading games online retailer. And so I applied for a job working, basically populating their database with game knowledge. They needed someone who knew games and could help them populate the database of 4,000 products that they just bought from a wholesaler with information. And I ended up working at that startup for a couple of years. I was there until 2002. The company ended up going bust and being sold for £1 to one of its competitors. And during that time, I made a lot of industry connections because I was doing a lot of roles. I was buying games from wholesalers. I was dealing with customers. I was trying to get hold of review copies from PR people for us to put reviews on our site. It was a very diverse role. And once that company ended, I ended up applying for a job at a publisher, which was SCI Games, who were very local to where I was in London. And I started there in 2002, initially working as a production assistant. So I was helping out the producers on the team. But very quickly, the guy who sat next to me wanted to offload this acquisitions responsibility onto me. He was handling it on top of being a producer. And he said, can you start looking at these games? These games were being sent by developers. And basically, I discovered I was really good at it. It involves sorting lots of data, evaluating games effectively, and a lot of people skills. That's the role I ended up doing for over a decade through 2 corporate mergers.
For people out there, so acquisitions, it's which developers the publisher is going to work with, or is it like for company merger kind of acquisition?
Yeah, we actually used to get that confusion a lot. People would ring me up thinking I was involved in the mergers and acquisitions bit. But no, in games, acquisitions means acquiring content, signing up new games. And the closest analogous role is the role of an A&R person in a music company at a record label. Someone at a record label gets sent a demo tape or hears a band in concert and then goes, I think this could be a hit, and goes and offers the band a contract, and the record label pays to make their record and then put it out.
Hopefully I'm not oversimplifying it because I don't want to know anybody out there, but certainly we do have some younger listeners. So if they're in GameStop and there's a game on the shelf and it's developed by such and such studios, but it's published by Electronic Arts or Activision or whatever, the role is sort of negotiating that relationship or finding those people to pair up?
Yeah, it's about finding the team. Games from publishers generally are made in one of 2 ways. They're either developed by an internal team, which means a team of developers are wholly employed directly by the publisher. So that would be, for instance, Ubisoft Montreal, working on something like Assassin's Creed, is a team that's completely funded by Ubisoft. All the staff there are on the Ubisoft payroll. For
Boomblocks, I worked for Electronic Arts making that game, but at the same time, they were also publishing lots of games made by external companies.
Yeah, and an example of an external game would be something like Just Cause games, published by Square Enix.
Right.
The developer, Avalanche Studios, a separate company. They're not owned by Square Enix, but the games are published through Square Enix, and Square Enix is providing the funding for those developers to make the game. They have monthly targets to meet, called milestones, where certain features will have to be added to the game. The game will have had to make progress, and then the publisher pays money out, the studio uses to pay its staff.
In addition to funding, it's not just funding, right? There's a lot of different things publishers do for developers, right?
Yeah. Publishers provide a number of services for developers. It's mainly to do with getting the game to market, especially for when we're talking about boxed games, it involves things like dealing with a retailer, the shops, dealing with a wholesaler, which is the company that ships the games to the shops from a large warehouse to all the different retailers around the country. Dealing with things like the format holders, so that's Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo. Arranging for localization of a game, you're translating it into other languages. Arranging for QA, because obviously people like Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo require the game to be bug-free to a certain level for it to be released. And also pressing the discs. If it's a game on a physical media, then someone's got to actually arrange for the discs to be manufactured. That's the side the publisher does. Publisher also markets and promotes the game by paying for advertisements and also arranging PR events, showing the game at trade shows, for instance.
Big reasons, right, why publishers can do these things that developers can't, besides just often very expensive, but basically they have these maintained relationships with either distributors or with press, etc., right? Yeah. External QA can be distributed, so it's this game one week, this game another week, versus a studio might not need all that stuff year-round kind of situation.
Precisely. The publisher does this stuff day in, day out, and has relationships or internal teams to handle all of these areas. So it means the developer can concentrate on making the game without having to worry about all these other elements. The thing is, nowadays, there are lots of routes for developers to get to market without going through a publisher, whether that's self-publishing on Steam or on iOS, or getting funding through, say, Kickstarter. However, the tasks that the publisher handles, what I call the publishing tasks, they still need to happen.
Right.
Someone still needs to promote the game to the public. Someone needs to make sure that game is QA'd enough to be able to pass submission at Sony, for instance.
And to go back to your career track stuff within acquisitions, you're sort of picking which horses to bet on.
Yeah, you see a lot of pitches. At a major publisher, you're probably looking at a new pitch, probably an average of at least one a day, if not several a day, all year round. It's not spread out evenly. You go to something like E3 or GDC, you meet with a lot of developers and you might see 50 pitches or more in a week. But other times of the year, it'll be quieter. Developers obviously try and have their pitches ready for these big events. And then what you do, you look at the materials you've been sent, well, that might be a demo, it might just be a PowerPoint presentation, description of a game, and then you try and pick which ones you think are a good fit for the company you work for, and you then almost become the product champion. Your job is to go to other people inside the publisher and get their opinion on the game and try and persuade the management that this is a game that the company should be publishing. So you end up actually, on one hand, evaluating pitches, but also pitching yourself to other people in your company to try and sell them on the idea of the game.
I'm a little bit reminded of many years ago when I would be in science fair as a kid, and I'd have this judge, and I could tell my judge had a lot of good charisma to him. And I was like, oh, good, because when this judge goes back and talks to the other judges, they're going to make a better case for me than one of the quieter people might. You need an internal champion.
That's exactly it. A good acquisitions person can be a great internal champion for the game. And interesting for me now, I'm sitting on the other side of the table, as I say. I'm kind of a gamekeeper turned poacher. My role now, representing developers, is to help them secure publishing deals. I've been on the publisher side of the table, sitting there in judgment of the games that pass in front of me. And now I'm doing the opposite role. I'm acting as advocate for the developer, trying to persuade people in my old job that the game I'm representing is a good game to back.
It's an incredible power that you know what they're looking for.
Yeah, it's a big advantage having worked the publisher side and understanding what publisher is looking to get out of a deal, what their pressure points might be. We talk about in negotiation, pressure points, or really the things that matter most to each party. The publisher side of the business is often very opaque and very confusing to developers. So having someone who understands how the publisher thinks and what the publisher cares about is very important.
Now, speaking of opaque, I certainly at no point mean to be asking for any kind of confidential or proprietary information, but can you say just for listeners, what order of magnitude these kind of deals look like? I mean, 5-digit, 6-digit plus question mark? Some people out there, they think in terms of iPhone Kickstarter games, and other people have no idea what goes on in terms of costs or time for console game kind of stuff.
It's different. So generally I'd split things into kind of three kind of tiers. The biggest tier is boxed console games. They probably these days on PS4 and Xbox One probably cost at least $20 million to make. These are really big productions. So those are the kind of things that I was signing up when I was working on the publishing side.
That's without marketing cost, right? That's just development.
Yeah, that's just development.
Right.
And generally take 2 or more years to make with a large team of developers, as many as 100 people working on a project. Then you have a tier of games which I think of as high quality digital games. So these are games that are probably releasing at a price point of maybe $20 or less on PSN or Xbox Live. Think about games like Firewatch, Journey, The Witness. These are the kind of games that probably have budgets in the order of $5 million or less, between maybe $1 and $5 million.
I've heard some people call these triple I for like the triple A of indies.
Yeah, that's it, the triple I product. Yeah, because it really is. It's AAA quality, but a much smaller game. A game that you can maybe finish in 5 or 6 hours, rather than a $60 boxed game, which you'd probably be playing for dozens of hours. Something like Fallout 4, say.
On the one end, it's not playing the I'm a poor indie, here's my pixel art card, and on the other, it's also not going toe-to-toe with Call of Duties, etc.
Precisely.
Right.
And then below that, you probably have a tier of true PC indie games that are being made for hundreds of thousands of dollars or less. We kickstarted, it's stuff that's self-published potentially, coming out through Steam. And similarly, iOS is an interesting one because obviously on iOS there are games like Flappy Bird and Crossy Road, very simple games being made by just 1 to 3 or 4 people for a very small budget. Then you also have kind of games that are probably more kind of premium games, I'm going to say, maybe not necessarily premium priced, but
sure,
potentially costing $1 million. And then you have games which are the kind of Game of War type or Clash of Clans games, which are being made.
Candy Crush
Candy Crush being made with a lot larger team and really kind of striking for the fences, as people say. A lot of money's going in to make the game have constant new content, but it could potentially be a very big hit,
driving up those user acquisition costs. As we all know.
those ongoing live games have to have big teams to support them with lots of customer service and lots of content generation.
Right.
So they're out, a small team can't make a game like that and can't successfully support it.
Which can be so deceptive sometimes from the outside, where it might seem like mechanically there's not a whole lot going on, or it's like, well, it's, match 3. Who can't write a match 3 game? But there's so much more going on there. Business-wise, technology back-end-wise, like I say, customer support and everything else.
Yeah, and obviously mobile games depend very heavily on analytics, the idea that you can gather data about how players are playing the game. This is something that's coming in on console games a bit more, but obviously a console game, the data really just helps you build the next game in the series. Right. It doesn't help you adjust the game you're releasing right now. Whereas on a mobile game, the kind of data that's gathered is things like, when do players stop playing the game, or how long they spend in each level. So the developers can see maybe on level 3 a lot of players seem to get stuck. Well, maybe we need to make that level a bit easier so people can keep playing beyond it. So that real-time data allows them to tweak and improve the game. Right. Obviously, a lot of it's used in free-to-play games to try and drive purchases of in-app purchases to help get over progression bumps. That's a whole other conversation for another day.
I've heard game designers be frustrated with some of the analytics and metrics and see it as only a matter of, the game needs to be easier, we're going to make it easier here or whatever. But there's really obviously, those are just clues and data, which the team is then welcome to try all kinds of other solutions to, which sometimes is teach the player better earlier, provide them some other clues ahead of time, just whatever it is to smooth out those bumps so people don't shelf the game, give up on it, etc. And ultimately they wind up seeing and playing more of the game, which really is what everybody wants in the first place. Yeah,
it could be something like there's a weapon that's been introduced, but players don't tend to use it. It's like, okay, well, maybe the tutorial for that weapon didn't make sense, or players weren't confident with it and they didn't feel it was useful for them. And then so that might be reworked.
Which really beats the old way of we make a bunch of educated guesses, cross our fingers and hope that these seem balanced. Like our group of 12 testers we could find seem to like it.
Yeah. It's a very different world.
Arsenal's the name of your current agency. Is it just you? Is it a small team of people you kind of brought together?
So Arsenal Agency, the company I'm working for at the moment, is founded by a friend of mine, Tina Kowaleski. She worked at Sony Santa Monica for a long time. And when she left Sony, she started working for herself, helping some developers she knew through that. And when I ended up finishing up my time at Square Enix in probably 2013, I then came on board with her as well. It's just a company of 2 of us, but we represent, it varies, but between about a dozen and 15 developers at any one time.
Out of that, can you say just kind of what do you look for in developers? I mean, there's a lot of people out there, maybe a question mark over their head of I don't know, should I call Caspar? Additionally, what sort of things do you do once you kind of are in those relationships besides obviously kind of, dial up the publisher?
Representation is something that's not right for every developer. If you're just starting out and you're just beginning to build up a studio, it probably doesn't make sense for you to get an agent or a business manager to help you out. It's probably an expense that won't pay immediate dividends for you. The studios we generally work with are people who are either established independents, who a couple of release games under their belt, but maybe don't want to have a permanent business person on staff. We don't tend to work so much with teams that are just starting out, though we do have a couple. We're much more selective over those kinds of clients. And then we also work with a couple of studios who are very established and where we are really truly fulfilling what could be an internal function. But by working with us externally, those teams get our expertise at a discount effectively, rather than having someone on staff who might not be busy when the studio has lots of paid work. Instead, they can tap into us just when they need it.
And a little bit, and it's not to discount all the other things, all the other many things he does, but sort of like Rami as half of Lambeer does a ton of flying around, talking to people in meetings, etc., to help those games happen at the scale they do. You're sort of like a higher outable version of that for, like you say, studios that have games under their belt, already have momentum, and so on.
In a way, it's interesting, actually. So Rami's a guy I have a lot of respect for, but there is a bit of this kind of pernicious fallacy in the industry about this kind of myth of that you need to be a kind of indie renaissance man to succeed, yeah? I actually see guys like Rami and Mike Bithell, for instance, as outliers. In fact, generally, it's very hard to have both the skill set for business and the skill set for being a great developer. They're completely different skills to be a good coder or to be a good artist, and then to be good at pitching a game. And a lot of developers make the mistake of thinking they have to do it for themselves, because they look at a guy like Rami and say, oh my God, he's doing his community work, he's doing his PR work, he's making the game, he's speaking at events, this is all, I've got to be able to do all those things. Most people can't do those things. I'm someone who couldn't go out there and code or do the art for a game. I'm just someone who's good on the business side. And a lot of the studios I see that are successes are ones where the founders brought different skill sets to the table. It's interesting that often the business side of a company is kind of ignored, maybe.
It's just so invisible to consumers.
Yeah. As a gamer, you want to hear about the visionary designer or the amazingly talented artist or the supremely bright coder, and you don't want to hear about the guy who's doing the marketing or the behind-the-scenes business transactions. However, to be a successful company, often you need those people to free the creative guys to just do their job.
Well, I know my game training stuff. I had tried running a business 6 years ago doing the same kind of thing. I didn't have a business partner who knew the business side of stuff. Got overwhelmed by sitting there staring at things that he finds very easy, doesn't have any problem doing. Man, back when I tried to do it without someone there kind of helping to hold up that end, I couldn't focus on doing my part of actually teaching and building materials and etc. Like you say, different of not everyone's both types or all kinds. And some people find those just much more natural, much more easy, much more comfortable.
I completely agree. Another benefit of using an external company to do business development is that you as a developer won't have time to keep tabs on publishers' shifting needs.
Right.
A publisher might be looking for one type of game at the start of the year, and 6 months later, their needs will have completely changed. And similarly, the people who are the business contacts, the acquisitions people at the publishers, are constantly changing. People move jobs, or they're promoted, or a new person comes in, or the structure, the whole structure of that business unit changes. As a developer, you don't have time to constantly be checking in with those publishers. Whereas an external person, our job is to be abreast of all those changes and to be constantly checking with publishers, saying, hey, what do you need? Maybe, do you need someone to help you port some games? Because obviously we don't just represent developers who are making original games. We also represent teams that do work for hire. For instance, a game that's on PC, a publisher might want to port that game to PS4 and Xbox. But that isn't necessarily done by the team who created the original game. The original team might be working on a sequel already, or something completely different for a different company.
A couple episodes ago, I was talking to a guy who worked on one of the Tomb Raider kind of spin-off mobile or Steam games or something that was not like the full main studio doing it.
Yeah, that's actually very common in the industry. So there are teams that completely make their living from doing that kind of work.
I think that's a good point there of those contacts at publishers and what they need, what they want, or so on, shift around so constantly. Because, the next best thing that developers try to do is kind of, we've got our circles of developers kind of network with each other. And it'd be like, hey, who has a contact over at, you name it, Microsoft or Sony or whatever. And someone will be like, I knew this guy named Peter who was there. I'm not sure if he's still there. Or they'll be like, what was it like to work with such and such as a company? They're like, well, it seemed good at the time, but those people may not be there. And it's just a headache of how to crack into that. Unless, like you say, you as a sort of intermediary layer keep those connections fresh and are in the conversation and know what they want, know what they're currently looking for. And I assume, too, you kind of said, I think, vaguely, partly tongue-in-cheek, then you call people you used to work with. But I'm sure you manage to a bunch of publishers, right? Not just your former employer.
Yeah. I think our total list of publishers is about 80 companies.
Goodness.
But the other thing, it brings around a good point, is that a mistake developers often make is thinking they need to just reach out to every publisher under the sun. Whereas, of course, we often... From that 80, we may only pitch a game to... I just did one recently where we only talked to 6 companies. because the game was very wacky, very weird, and we felt there were just 6 companies that would get it, that could look at this and go, okay, I get what you're trying to do. And of those 6, actually 4 of them really did, and got back, were interested in the game. I got one CEO actually messaged me on Skype saying, "Oh my God, you've got half my office playing this game. We need to talk."
Excellent.
So it's about selecting publishers for whom the game seems like a fit.
It's not even good or bad. It's just some stuff need a certain kind of match.
Yeah, and you can see some publishers have a very distinct identity. Look at a company like, say, Devolver. They generally publish edgy action games. They don't publish strategy games. They don't publish kids games. Paradox are a company that makes hardcore strategy games. They don't produce arcade games or action games or sports games. Think about the type of game you're making, and then think about, okay, if you saw this in a publisher's lineup, would it be incongruous? Would it stand out? Would the fans of that publisher go, okay, that totally makes sense that this is a game that's coming out through Sega or that's coming out through Square Enix?
Right.
I mean, actually, one of the problems we had when I was at Square is that often if we were making games that weren't RPGs, fans would be annoyed. They're fans of Square because they love RPGs.
Since you've been doing this since maybe 15 years ago, how have you seen kind of the publishing layer change? I mean, obviously we've seen, like you say, major disruptions from mobile and so on.
I think one of the things the average gamer and consumer on the street doesn't see is a lot of how much change there's been to costs in terms of how much it costs to make a full-size console games. Mm-hmm. When I started out at SCI, the company was just about to release Conflict Desert Storm, which was a game for PS2, Xbox, the original Xbox that is, GameCube and PC. And it cost, probably for all 4 of those formats, it cost only $3 or $4 million. And the game went on to sell 2 million copies. Now, fast forward 10 years after that, in kind of 2012 time period, you're looking at games for PS4, Xbox One, PC, and you're talking of development budgets of north of $20 million. However, the games are still only selling, the size of the market for the game to sell to has maybe doubled, but the costs have gone up by a factor of 10. Which is why you're able to you see things where a game sells 3 or 4 million units and the publisher still says, "Oh, it isn't really a success." It's because so much money has gone into making it, and part of that is the high resolution assets needed for the new formats, and just the way that production values have got higher and higher and higher. Everything from quality of the voice recording, music, and just the more coding needed to get the ring power from the systems.
That's a great point. The games have gotten so much more expensive. The audience has obviously increased in size, but not in proportion to it. And meanwhile, we're still largely paying the same price or less per game in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and the reason a lot of the audience growth has happened on mobile.
Right.
That's where the audience's growth has been, not so much on console. And PC is a kind of a constant market in the background, which is it always gets written off, but it's always doing well because people have PCs. That's been one big change, and that change affected the profitability of a lot of medium-sized and smaller publishers, and also medium-sized and smaller developers. In that PS2 era, if you were gaming at that time, you'll remember there were lots of licensed games based on movies. Even really quite small, not blockbuster movies would often have a licensed game made of them. And that was because those games were cheap to make. They only cost less than $1 million. And so they didn't need to sell that many units to be a success. Normally, the publisher pays a license fee to the movie company to use it. And there's all sorts of problems that can come with that. At one point with SCI, we were working on a title that had to come out at the same date as the movie, and then the movie date was announced, and it was the same day that Gran Turismo 3 and Metal Gear Solid 3 were coming out, and we're trying to release a PS2 game. As you can imagine, that game did very poorly on release.
Maybe about a month or two ago, an episode with somebody who they worked on Vampire Bloodlands Masquerade, which was released same day as Half-Life 2.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So that's part of it. So a lot of studios were able to make a living doing those kind of projects. And then as costs went up, they were forced out of business. And similarly, a lot of the mid-tier publishers were also forced out of business. And that's why I think companies such as THQ aren't around today. And you've seen this consolidation in just a few larger publishers who are taking bigger and bigger bets. But it means that if one game doesn't succeed, the company takes a huge financial hit. And that's why a company like what was IDOS, now Square Enix Europe, is only releasing probably 2 or 3 large titles a year, Hitman, Tomb Raider, Just Cause. Whereas if you look at IDOS in the year, around about 2000, they were releasing maybe 5 or 6 different PC games, wildly different games. You're releasing Hitman, Beach Life, Anachronox, a much greater variety of games.
Also just had a call with a guy who worked on Anachronox.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
For instance, what happened is a lot of that innovation has moved into the indie scene. Developers, publishing for themselves.
Taking chances has gotten so much more out of the question at that 20 million plus scale. So the consumer need for really wacky stuff has come from people who are moonlighting or doing it on a small loan or whatever, right?
Yeah, and because obviously you can make interesting games for a lot less, for a few $100,000. It's just they're not going to look like Call of Duty.
Right. One of the things I like to point out in my talks is that even if we make a lineup of some of the super high profile, big hitter, super successful indie games who made millions of dollars out of, they still look nothing even remotely like AAA stuff. Yeah. They are still night and day, quirky, weird, very stylized, very different, very low, whatever, just not the same beast at all.
Yeah, and the reason for that is that it's something that happens in a lot of industries, but the blockbuster AAA games are much like blockbuster movies. They are the lowest common denominator. You need to sell so many of them. You want to make a game that a really large number of people can be interested in play. So you don't want anything that's going to be divisive or awkward,
Right.
So the content becomes somewhat bland and predictable. It's like what last year, well, let's make that again.
Little formulaic.
Yeah, it becomes formulaic. That's a great way of putting it. That's not because people are sitting there wanting to make a bad game or wanting to be uncreative. It's the market forces and the need to make profit. And companies aren't charities. They're there to make money. Drive those decisions.
This formula, kind of the point, right, is that there's something predictable there, which at that level of money, they have to be taking smart bets on their odds or whatever.
Yeah, they kind of play with percentages. They don't want to do anything that's too risky.
Even though there are these kind of weird shining gems of people love these games that people seem to have spent very little time or money on, increasingly, right, is it fair to say, and it seems like a lot of that has been squeezed out by sheer just volume, and increasingly it's more that 6-digit range where people kind of have to go to differentiate their product at this point for downloadables and such.
Yeah, I guess there's two sides of that. The consumer doesn't care what it costs you to make the game.
Right. Yeah? They don't care if it was made with fairy dust. They just
exactly.
Yeah.
And your game isn't going to exist in a vacuum. It's going to sit on a shelf, a digital shelf next to other games, and also including previous games. People often forget it's not just for games that are coming out at the same time. It's for games that are now available on discount. If you're making a game that competes with Street Fighter 5, there's Street Fighter 4, 3, 2, 1, all available at lower and lower price points. Right. I guess that's probably a bad example because those are some very old games. But last year's version of, if you're making a shooter, it's not just Call of Duty, it's last year's version of Call of Duty that's now half the price. Consumers don't know anything about their budget. They just look at the game and go, is this value for money for me? And of course, that AAA stuff pushes people's expectations of quality higher and higher. If you're a big company who can afford to put that stuff in, it's in your interest to push that expectation. I mean, one of the things that happened with licensed games in the previous era was EA kind of set this expectation that the games would have the licensed actors in them. Because they could afford to pay for those actors to have them facially captured,
Lord of the Rings
have their
and
voices
so on
in the game. And what it meant was smaller companies that couldn't afford that, consumers would look at their game and see it as subpar.
I remember that being a big deal for some of the Star Wars games and stuff, even where they just didn't have the actors' likeness and voices.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a big Buffy fan, and the Buffy game on Xbox, they had to use a sound alike because they couldn't afford to have Sarah Michelle Gellar voice the main character.
I'd also heard that for stuff like Spider-Man, I don't remember which Spider-Man console game it was, but Tobey Maguire made probably more money for his 8 hours in a sound booth as their lead engineer did for the whole time because you can't replace him.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. That's one side of it. Another element is the fact that some features, such as online multiplayer, are expensive to implement and test. And as there becomes a consumer expectation for multiplayer to be online, not just local, that is a really expensive and awkward thing to add in.
A gate to entry now, where for a lot of these kind of games, if you don't have it, even at a AAA scale, people start asking a bunch of questions like, why are you single player only?
Yeah, and there's also a lot of stuff behind the scenes. I mean, I work with Sarnix, who've just done Rocket League, which has been a big success. But a lot of people don't realize there's actually a lot of matchmaking and the way that the game sets up matches behind the scenes. There's actually a lot of clever code involved with that. It isn't just a question of you log in, it drops you in the first match you can find. It carefully tries to match you with people on the same skill level, the same geographical area, so you get better ping. That stuff is very kind of transparent to the consumer. It's great work by those guys, but it is transparent. But it still needs to happen behind the scenes. That's, I guess, one of the things is consumers, they don't know how the game's made. So they don't know a lot about where the money goes and what's hard and what's easy in games.
I'll see people on the internet complain about players don't appreciate how much games cost, and they don't, and they shouldn't. They it's not their problem to worry about any more than with the films. Some movies cost, hundreds of millions of dollars. Some movies people pull off for 5 digits somehow.
Precisely. And the thing that matters is whether you're interested in the game and what you think's a fair price for the entertainment you're going to receive.
Right.
Talking of film, that reminds me of the other point I was going to make, is I think one of the things that games have struggled with is that we don't have a mature award system that feeds back into consumer interest. Why do movie companies not just make summer blockbusters? And the answer is because they want to make more challenging movies because they want to compete for awards,
Right.
The latest Transformers movie isn't going to win an Oscar.
I'm still holding out.
I'm sure Michael Bay's holding out as well. Film prizes go to movies that deal with socially conscious issues or difficult themes of things like, family breakdown, tragedy. And those are things that games haven't really touched on so much in the past because we don't have a route for a game to win awards and then people who wouldn't have considered it beforehand.
At the very least, it seems like most of the awards that we have are, say, GDCs and Indiecades, which are predominantly kind of overwhelmed by indie games, certainly at least at this point. There's dozens of different magazines that all kind of have their own version of Game of the Year, any one of which then will become like a checkbox on the packaging of, Game of the Year edition.
We don't have one award that's seen as the true kind of pinnacle of the awards, the way that an Oscar is for a movie. I mean, maybe the BAFTAs in the UK are getting there because they very quickly, a few years ago, really set up games as equal to film and TV.
Right.
BAFTA treats games very well, and that gives it a lot of prestige. The award ceremony is televised, and because BAFTA's known for film and TV, it's easier for even non-gamers in the public to kind of get why it's important to win one.
Right.
The way it works in movies is that people will check out a movie that maybe they might have seen as too highbrow or too not up their alley, but if it wins 5 Oscars, they're like, okay, maybe I should check that out. But games, that doesn't exist so much. And that means that the commercial side of the business, the publishers, just keep making the blockbuster stuff because that's where the money is. It's up to the indies to go out there and try and make games that are more challenging and more off the beaten path, just trying out different areas of gameplay that no one else is looking into. And that's great. That's led to a healthy ecosystem. I think over time that will feed back into the AAA. I don't think, in, say, 20 years, the AAA side of the industry will still be wholly dominated by blockbuster entertainment and, on the other hand, Skinner box clicker games on mobile. I think we're in a period where that's the case, but that will go away. I also think what we'll see is a lot more of that kind of individual publisher identity. Devolve is a good example, so is Paradox. And Codemasters, I think, are finally doing what I wish they'd done years ago, which is becoming a very racing game-focused publisher and not doing anything else. Because if you can build a brand that says, look, we do this one thing and we do it super well, then that's how you get people to be brand loyal to you, is because they know they're going to get a particular thing done incredibly well. We're living in a golden age for games. There's a lot of exciting stuff happening, and the variety of games out there is just increasing because a lot of the barriers of entry have come down. It's a lot easier for someone to self-publish. But the tricky thing people need to realize is that the barrier to success is just as high as ever. It's a lot easier to get a game out, but it's just as hard, if not harder than ever, to be a success. There's so many games being released, particularly the app stores, iOS and Android, and also on Steam. There's just so many games out there for players to choose from. How does an individual developer make their game stand out and have a hope of reaching enough sales to keep funding their company and make a sequel or another game?
For a while, release on Steam was kind of a golden ticket for at least proportionally, a pretty solid fraction of things that got involved in there at all. It's, so many people kind of battered at the doors with their frustrations over it being a closed garden or closed system. They wanted their games on there too. And now so many people can, but it is certainly not what it used to be in terms of lots of games can get on there. And they've kind of opened up the gates to, well, we'll let the customers sort it out. And they are.
They are. And that would, if you're going to ask me what's the most important advice I give to developers, it's that game needs a reason to exist. If your game doesn't offer players something that they can't get elsewhere, they're very unlikely to check it out. You've got two routes. You can either offer them something they're used to, but done better than before, more polished, slicker, newer.
Which is hard unless you're throwing around a lot of money.
Yeah, and that's the AAA route. It's right. The same game as last year, but now it's shinier. Whereas for an indie, you need to be offering an experience the player can't get elsewhere that's going to be fresh to them and going to be interesting to them. It doesn't necessarily mean the game has to be utterly innovative in every way possible. Point-and-click adventure, it's still going to play like a point-and-click adventure, but if yours has an interesting setting, interesting characters, and a storyline and themes that haven't been explored before, you're more likely to find an audience than a game that retreads the same ground that's been covered previously. this is a lot harder than it sounds. When I was on the acquisition side, I would probably be rejecting 99.5% of everything I saw. And many of the games that were rejected were games where the designers were thinking in terms of what they wanted to make rather than what gamers wanted to play. They were playing another game and going like, oh, Devil May Cry is awesome. I could do a better version of that. I want to make my own version of that. And making something that, if you put it in front of the consumer's going to say, well, you know what? I'm just going to buy last year's version of Devil May Cry because it's like $10 and it's actually better. I'd get pictures which were like, it's so-and-so, but in space. Or like, oh, it's set in a fantasy setting. And normally the kind of setting and story is not that big a drive for people to play a game. People play stuff because they want to play different gameplay. It's not like a movie where it is more important to look at the story and the setting. For games, I often said to people, you get 3 sentences on the back of a box and like 4 screenshots. And it's the same on Steam. You've got like a little trailer and a handful of screenshots and a short description. And that's what you've got to persuade someone to dive into the game on.
Well, and that's another one of those reasons why, in these different scales, they can't take as many risks of doing really weird stuff because it's got to come through, like you say, in a few sentences and pictures for at least the percentage of customers, which is probably a non-trivial number, who discover it on a shelf or discover it in an app store or something and not through some other, watching every hour of possible footage on YouTube or something about it.
Oh, totally. And that's why I often say now that on the App Store, the most important thing to invest money in is making a brilliant app icon.
Oh, yeah. They've been saying the icon, they've been stressing that since like 2009 was when they were like, that's the deciding thing. If you got to...
Yeah, it's the equivalent of your box art for a retail console game. You've got to catch people's attention and make, what is this? And I think that's also why you're seeing a lot of games that are kind of more... Why wackiness maybe is on the increase, because it's an interesting way, it's an easy way to immediately get people's attention if something's unusual. I mean, let's look at a game like kind of Dropsy. It's like a game about a clown who goes around hugging people. Well, that's a bit different. I haven't heard of a game that did that before. So instantly you've got people's attention in a way that another game about, a space marine shooting space orcs isn't going to capture the same attention.
Mandragora team, that's Mandragora team on Twitter, tweeted some pictures of different versions of art they had for a character, like their artwork for this game called Sky Hill. The earlier versions looked like a giant hamster, and the later version looked more and more like kind of just an ogre, like a good ogre, but just an ogre. And several people replied like, hey, I actually think the hamster version is kind of more unique and interesting, this earlier draft. Maybe go back to that. It's more wacky, it's more eye-catchy, it's more iconic if it's not just a well-done thing we recognize or something, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, sometimes being wacky for wackiness' sake comes across as insincere. But I think for indies, doing that lowest common denominator route is often a bad idea because you end up with a game that's a bit too bland, a bit too generic, a bit too formulaic.
Not for anybody in particular.
We touch on sincerity. I think in all walks of life, everyone has a pretty developed sense. We know when someone's phoning something in and just doing it for the paycheck. You can just sense it.
Yeah.
Compared to something that's made with passion, whether that's everything from food or drink or games, acting. You can just tell. And that's the advantage that indies have, is that on one hand, they don't have the resources the publishers have, but they also don't have the restrictions. They don't have the carefully managed PR campaigns. They can talk to other indies for advice. They can talk directly to their consumers in a way that people inside large AAA developers just can't. They're restricted by NDAs, they're restricted by very careful plans. And that's what happens when you're spending tens of millions of dollars. Everything becomes very regimented. And also all large organizations have bureaucracy. It's just something that comes about from scale. So smaller developers can be more nimble and they can take more risks.
The thing I always like to close on, if someone in 2016, and understandably this is always hard because it's different from what happened in 2002, etc., if they wanted to get into this kind of line of work that you're involved with either as an agency or as a representative for developers or in the side of a publisher, etc., what advice would you have for them? Is it something with a certain kind of college degree that you think is a fit? Is it something that you think certain type of work would set them up for?
It's interesting because I think nowadays this kind of job, the best fit for it is some sort of business or marketing degree, but it is not a prerequisite. And actually that's true in many areas in management in the game industry. You often find people who don't have degrees in relevant subjects or didn't go to college at all. So it's not a barrier there. I think to do well in this kind of job, you need to be interested in the business side of things. And you said if you have friends who are maybe stronger in, say, development disciplines like art, audio, or coding, and you might be someone who does those things, but you're not the best on a team, and you are the one who's interested in, for instance, selling the game. I mean, selling the concept in both ways, both to like talking about it to investors or talking about it to consumers. Then you should maybe consider being the person who takes on that responsibility and being the business development person. to me, I've always been fascinated about what makes people buy things. The idea of why is it we choose one product over another? I mean, I guess I may sound very soulless here by saying about something like product, but it applies to everything from consumer goods to entertainment products. You have all sorts of interesting mental processes to choose what to spend their money on. And I guess I've always had a fascination into that side of things.
It's like you say, it can sound a little soulless, like, oh, business, but it's at the end of the day, such an important and entirely human question of how consumers are spending their time and how developers are spending their time.
Yeah, it's also a very people skill job, being able to deal with different people from different backgrounds and speak to them and convince them. Decisions about what to fund aren't made really about profit and loss and schedules. That stuff all gets checked off, but the thing that determines whether the game gets funded is often the emotional response of people at the publisher. If you look at somebody and go, oh, we've got to be involved in this, I really want to be involved in bringing this game to market, that's kind of the thoughts people have that make a game happen. Because there's so much, the other thing is there's publishers and funding entities have so much product available they could invest in that if something's just meh, they'll be like, oh, we'll pass. We'll wait for something, the thing that makes us super excited. Being able to get people excited about a game, be able to talk to people in different disciplines about games and getting them excited. Because you might be trying to get other team members excited about coming on board and helping out. Or you might be trying to create a Kickstarter video that's going to get members of the public to fund the game. Or you could be talking to a publisher executive twice your age about funding the game. You need to be able to work out how to speak to those different groups of people.
Such a great point about being able to show the passion of it, because that's something where I've seen lots and lots of very smart, very capable engineer, designer type people who, by the time they're trying to tell people about their game at conferences or other pitching meetings or otherwise, they're just so exhausted with it. And all they see are the bugs and the problems and the stuff they haven't gotten to yet. And it's just so hard to have that first moment of excitement about it that still is new to somebody else, and having someone else who that's their skill, that's their comfort. That's a whole big thing.
I've just spent the week, preparing, helping my team prepare for GDC. So I've been doing mock pitches where a developer runs through the pitch they're going to give with me, so I can critique it, help them with their delivery, and things that need to be changed in the deck. As you said, that's one of the issues people on the development team often have is you're so close to the product that you don't know how to talk about it to someone who doesn't know anything about it. You can't take away your knowledge of it. You've got to put yourself in a mindset of, what if I knew nothing about this? Right. How would I get someone excited about it? The other thing I was going to say, the other skill that's really important is you need to care about games in a wider sense. You need to be someone who plays a lot of games, not just in your favorite genre, but is prepared to check things out in other genres and has an understanding of the wider market. Often people on the development team are too busy making their game to check out other games that are coming out. You sometimes will have developers would come to me at IDOS and they'd pitch stuff and not realize that other games had come out doing exactly the same thing just because they have it too head down to know what else is being released.
Sure. Sometimes on the developer side, someone has to do to get their thing out the door. But like you say, someone's got to keep that vision out as to what else is going on so they don't get blindsided.
So if you've got those things, people skills, an interest in the business side of things, and a strong knowledge of games, then it's a role that could be a fit for you. And the only thing about it is there's less people involved in it than other roles. Things like a project manager or a coder or an artist, there's multiple of those people on every team, whereas even in a large publisher, there might be only one or two acquisitions people. And in a developer, there's likely to only ever be one person doing business.
Or like you said, in your case, there's lots of businesses and one or two of you. I mean,
just a couple of us. It's interesting. The number of agencies in the game industry has been relatively static at about half a dozen during my time in the industry. Partly that's due to the decline in the number of mid-sized developers who can afford and need representation.
Right, yeah, because although there's many more developers, they're not ready to go out there and pay agency fees for any kind of outside support.
Yeah, and also because, different routes to market don't require that. If you're not paying for publisher funding, you're probably not going to be using a more traditional agency. Right. And similarly, but those companies may employ consultants in other ways. For instance, for other people who do specialist, say, Kickstarter consulting, where their skill set is about creating a really good Kickstarter pitch and helping people run it. So there's different elements there.
So the other thing I want to point them to is any websites or Twitter handles or other stuff they should check out to either find out more about you and your work or your company.
I don't post on it as much as I'd like to, but my Twitter handle is unfriendlyghost, so @unfriendlyghost. And our website is www.thearsenalagency.com.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks, enjoyed it.
Music at the start and end of this podcast is provided by Danny Baranowski. Use with permission.